Hey everyone, Percy Jules here. So lately one very popular request has been for me to make a kind of comparison video between Reaper and Studio One. Well, that is exactly what this is. So, which one is better and why? Let's just take a look at some of the differences and let's try to draw some kind of conclusion. Now first let me say that I'm in no way affiliated or sponsored by neither Kakas nor Presonus, the respective developers of Reaper and Studio One. This is just my honest opinion based on my experience and my knowledge of these two DAWs. Now let's start with price to give it all a little bit of context. So you can try out Reaper for 60 days and then officially you should buy a license. There are two different licenses. There's the so-called discounted license, which is $60. It's all in US dollars. If you have a company using Reaper and you make over $20,000, then officially you should buy the commercial license, and that is $225. Now whether you have the discounted license, the commercial license, or you're still reviewing it, the software is exactly the same. There is only one version of Reaper. Now Studio One on the other hand has three different versions. Now there is Studio One Prime, which is a very basic version that is completely free. Then there is Studio One Artist, which has some additional features that is around $100 or €100. And then there is Studio One Professional, and that will give you everything that Studio One has to offer, and that is around $400 or €400. Now in my opinion, one of the most important things, if not the most important things, why you would want to choose one DAW over another is the interface. So how does it look? How does it feel? Workflow? How easy does it make it for you to do whatever you need to do? So let's take a look at that, and let's start with appearances, which also very much ties into clarity, ease of use, and things like that. Now a while ago I did a video on pros and cons for Reaper, and in that video I mentioned that Reaper kinda looks and feels a bit outdated. Well, from the reactions I got, it seems like some people were actually offended by me saying that. Well, if that's the case, then I am truly sorry. I definitely don't want to offend anyone. At the same time, if I'm honest, I am gonna have to stick with that claim. And let me show you a few examples to illustrate what I mean. Now as soon as you open up Reaper, you can just see that it looks a little bit old-fashioned, especially if you compare it to something like Studio One. Studio One looks new, it looks fresh, it looks very contemporary. You can definitely see that a lot of attention, a lot of effort, and probably a lot of money has gone into the aesthetics. And yes, you can download a custom theme for Reaper, and on the surface it will make it look completely different. But still, even then you will be able to see and feel the difference with something like Studio One. And that will become even more evident if you take a look at something like the preferences window. I mean, not that there is anything wrong with it. It works, it'll get you to where you want to be, but it really looks like how software used to look at the beginning of the century. Now take a look at the options window in Studio One. Now again, you can clearly see that a lot of attention has gone into how it looks and feels, and that also very much adds to clarity. The way it is laid out just makes it a bit easier to work with. It makes it more intuitive. Now speaking of which, let's take a look at this example. So we're in Reaper and we want to have a track and add a plugin to it. Now the first thing we need to do is to create a track. Then we need to open the effects window, and let's just add the stock EQ plugin. Double click and done. Well, that's pretty easy, right? Now let's go to Studio One. Well, in Studio One you don't even really need to have a track first. Just pick any EQ, simply drag it to the track area and release. As you can see, a track has been created automatically with the EQ on it. By the way, again, notice the difference in aesthetics, but most of all notice how incredibly easy that is. Now another example, let's say that we want to add a send to a track. Well, in Reaper, and also in many other DAWs, you would first have to create a separate track to send the signal to. Then we would have to add some kind of plugin to that track, and then we would have to tell the software to send a portion of the signal from track A to track B. And that is usually how to set up a send. And that is absolutely fine. Again, this is how it works on probably most DAWs. Now in Studio One, again we can simply drag and drop any plugin effect onto the track that we want to apply a send to, and boom. Automatically an effects track has been created, the routing has already been taken care of for you, and that is how easy it is in Studio One. Now Studio One has a lot of drag and drop options like this, and also a lot of other little tricks and things, and actually the entire ecosystem has been set up in such a way that it is so intuitive and so incredibly easy to work with. So when it comes to workflow, if you ask me, Studio One is far ahead of Reaper, and frankly far ahead of many other DAWs as well. Now, one very strong point for Reaper is customizability. Studio One is pretty customizable. Reaper is ridiculous in that regard. You can really mold it and tweak it to make it look and behave exactly like you want it to, within its limitations, of course. I already talked about themes. There are tons of themes you can download and install very easily. You can completely customize the toolbars. You can rearrange all the menus. You can move things around. So very flexible. Now, another big plus for Reaper is that it is very light on your computer's CPU. I've used it on older computers that probably wouldn't have been able to even start up Studio One, so to speak. They were able to run Reaper with no problems at all. So very lightweight. Now, on the other hand, I have to say that especially if you're using Studio One Professional, I do understand why that might demand a little bit more power and put a little bit more pressure on your CPU, because it simply has a lot more and more advanced features than Reaper. So first, instrument plugins. By the way, in the Reaper pros and cons video, I mentioned that Reaper doesn't come with any sound libraries or instrument plugins at all. Well, technically that's not completely accurate. There are no sound libraries, but Reaper actually does have 2 or 3 instrument plugins. It's just that they are so extremely basic that in my opinion they're virtually unusable. Now Studio One, on the other hand, if you're using Studio One Artist or Studio One Professional, you'll get a few really good, pretty advanced instrument plugins. And even if you're using Studio One Prime, you'll get one of those instruments. So that's pretty cool. Also, you'll get a bunch of effects plugins. Now Reaper also has a few pretty decent effects plugins, but with Studio One you'll get a little bit more sophistication, and especially if you're using Studio Artist, and surely if you're using Studio One Professional, you'll get a lot more effects plugins. Now with Studio One you also get some really advanced features that Reaper simply doesn't have. I have to say that this mainly applies to Studio One Professional only, but let's just name a few. So for instance, the extended effects chain, which is highly advanced effects routing. You can split the signal coming from any track multiple times, and then you can apply different effects to all the single splits. And that will give you so much control when it comes to shaping sounds. Now another feature is multi-instruments. You can actually layer different instruments on the same track and create some really nice stacked sounds like that. There is the arranger track, which makes it super easy and fast to rearrange your song. There is the scratch pad, which allows you to very easily create different versions, different arrangements of the same song. And then the chord track, harmonic editing. You can pretty easily change the chord progression of any song. You can experiment with it, and that might give you some new ideas, potentially very useful for songwriters. Patterns is a pretty advanced step recording tool. You've got Melodyne integration, and also Studio One, as far as I know, is the first and probably still the only DAW, correct me if I'm wrong, that has a dedicated mastering suite built into it. Okay, so all of these features really take Studio One to another level. Now don't get me wrong, Reaper has a lot of features and you'll be hard pressed to find anything that you really cannot do with Reaper. But again, Reaper simply doesn't have all of these new advanced features. Doesn't mean that you cannot get the same results with Reaper. In most cases you can, but it will take you a few more steps, or in some cases a little bit of creativity to get you there. Now one thing I really like about Reaper is the community. Studio One is very popular, it has a large and active community, and I might be wrong about this, but I believe that the Reaper community is even more engaged. Now PreSonus, the developers of Studio One, they actually listen to their community. They will implement new features basically on request. And again, I might be wrong, but I think that Caucus, the developers of Reaper, are even more responsive. So it seems to me that Reaper is more community-based, whereas Studio One is much more a purely commercial product, with all the benefits and disadvantages that come with it. Now one thing that also seems to suggest exactly that is the platforms you can use these programs on. Studio One is available on both Windows and Mac. Reaper is available on Windows, Mac and Linux. Well, I don't know of any other major DAW developer who has made their software available on Linux. And I think that that also says a lot about the philosophy of this company, Caucus. Okay, so in conclusion, I would say that if you're on a budget, especially if you're new to music production, I would highly recommend Reaper. It's an amazing piece of software. It's full featured. Unless you have some extremely complex demands, you're not gonna run into its limitations. It's also very customizable, very flexible. There's a huge community you can connect to via forums or tutorial videos, for example. And on top of it all, you can try it out for 60 days and then you have to buy a license, which will only cost you $60. And that is truly a bargain for what you're getting. But you might think, okay, what about Studio One Prime? Reaper is $60, Studio One Prime is free, and you can utilize the, in my opinion, more sophisticated Studio One ecosystem. Yes, that is true. However, Studio One Prime comes with a lot of limitations. So for instance, yes, you'll get a few FX plugins and you'll get one instrument plugin. But that's it. That's all you're gonna get. And you cannot use third-party plugins. So that's very limited. So unless you have some real specific and really limited demands, I would always recommend Reaper over Studio One Prime. Now Studio One Artist, that's a bit tougher because you get more effects plugins out of the box. You'll get the full range of instrument plugins. Keep in mind though that if you want to use third-party plugins with Studio One Artist, you're gonna have to buy an add-on to make that possible, and that add-on will cost you around $80, $90 or euros, and that on top of $100 or euros for Studio One Artist itself, against $60 for Reaper. That to me personally would be the toughest choice to make. But then there is Studio One Professional. Well, I would say that if you're really serious about music production and money is not really an object, then I would definitely always recommend Studio One Professional over Reaper. It's visually very pleasing, it looks very polished, it's extremely intuitive, it comes with some really good plugins and some very advanced features which will allow you to do whatever you need to do very easily and very fast. So those are my thoughts on Reaper versus Studio One. I hope this helps. I hope this clarifies a few things for anyone who's still undecided or something. Anyway, thank you for watching.